to this presentation of Podcast on the Cheap, Podcast in a Bag. Here's your presenter, who apparently thinks he knows something about podcasting, Matthew Bach.
So that is actually how I start my podcast on a weekly basis. I actually have a sound bed or a music bed that introduces the show, and I have a voice of the show that comes in every week and does all of our intros. And I just want to kind of give you a feel of some of the different things. And this presentation is really geared more towards doing it in person, because a lot of it is showing you this is what you use, that is how you do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to roll with it, and I'm sure you are as well. I also, as a presenter, as someone who is very comfortable standing in front of a group, I often feed off of the audience. So I'm going to be using my own laugh track for when I tell a joke, just so that doesn't confuse anybody as far as what is actually going on. And I see a hand up already. What is that? Can you tell me?
That's a if you, I don't know that Eric's really trying to join the conversation, but maybe he is.
Okay. If you have a question anytime, I can see when there are things in the chat or hands that are raised. Otherwise, I'll just kind of push on with the presentation itself. And this is going to be a multifaceted thing. I know that the title was Podcast on the Cheap, Podcast on the Go, but in order to even establish a baseline with that, I'm going to go over the basics of what goes into a podcast, and that includes the process, the equipment, the services you need, etc. I'll explain how you can do a podcast with spending little to no money and what the trade-offs are for doing it that way as opposed to spending a lot of money. I'll also go through how I do my podcast. And in no way is this intended for me to be saying this is the way that you should do it or the correct way. This is just the way that I have figured out how to do it. And I've been doing this for about a year now, and I am still learning. I learned something about a month ago that actually dramatically improved the sound quality of my podcast that I just had not been doing before. And on a week-by-week basis, by accident, I will actually learn different things. And just so you know, I actually made this podcast deck for another presentation I did about 4 months ago. And I realized that I had to completely update some of it because I use almost none of the equipment I used 4 months ago because it's all been rotated out and other things. But I also am going to talk about podcasting on the go. And podcasting on the go, what I mean by that is right now I'm in a studio or my office, and I'm going to actually show you an easy and somewhat economical way that you can actually do decent podcasts out in the wild, whether that be at a bar or a cabin or whatever. And before I get into the actual world of podcasts, I just need to give you a little bit of a background of who I am so you understand where I'm coming from. So you have a baseline measurement. When I was a young kid, I actually was in speech therapy because I had a speech impediment. And to this day, I do have a slight stutter. And there are words I cannot say. And you might ask me, well, what are those words? And I can't tell you because I literally cannot say them. But in order to address this, I started talking in front of a group as often as I could. My first job in IT was actually doing training. I worked at a large multinational company that provided software for insurance companies. And I did training at over 200 different service centers throughout the US over the course of a couple of years. And then on a lark, I started doing stand-up at the Funny Bone in Columbus primarily, but I've been at a couple different clubs and I've performed in a couple different countries. And then I got into podcasting. Podcasting, the first time I did a podcast was about 3-4 years ago, but now I actually do one every week. And just how I actually got started in podcasts, believe it or not, it had to do with reality TV. And my wife and I were almost on The Amazing Race twice, didn't get on. I was almost on Big Brother twice, didn't get on. And I was almost on Survivor once again, did not get on. And you might ask what this has to do with podcasting is I actually was listening to a lot of podcasts about reality TV. And I got to know this guy. His name's Rob Cesternino. He actually has one of the most popular podcasts out there about entertainment. He's not on Joe Rogan levels, but he's very, very popular, and he has won several Webby awards for that. And he actually was reaching out to his listenership when he had a very small listener base, and he was looking for somebody to do a recap of the Titanic 3D re-release that came out like 4 or 5 years ago. And I have a background on the Titanic, so I reached out to him, and I ended up doing a couple different movie podcasts with him. And then I've also done some podcasts with other people in the Columbus IT community. Every now and then they'll want somebody who knows something about video games, which is like one of my areas of expertise, I guess. So I've been married for almost 20 years. It'll be 20 years in August. And a long time ago, I realized that text messages that you get after 11 are only good when you're single. Last May, I got this series of text messages from one of my buddies. So we should do a podcast. And I thought, hey, not a bad idea. 80s movies sounds even better. So I was all on board. I was all excited about this. And I told him, okay, just let me know where I need to be, what movie I need to do, and I'm more than happy to do that. Of course, it wasn't that simple. He did not know how to do that. And in his own words, he needed to rely on me to take care of that nerd stuff, which is kind of how he sees me. But on a podcast, there are multiple roles. There is the entertainment, the person that's talking, or the people that are talking. And that is not easy per se, but producing, which is doing all the behind the scenes stuff, getting all the things set up, making sure that it's published, making sure that it goes to the right sources. The producing part is an order of magnitude more difficult. So basically what my friend did was he gave me a part-time job that I'm not getting paid for. But in podcasting itself, there are what I call the 5 W's. There's what, who, when, how, the W is silent, and where. So on the what side, you need to know what your subject matter is. And almost everybody knows somebody that has a podcast. And there are literally millions of podcasts that have sprung up in the last year because of COVID. People are stuck at home. It is a great way for people to kind of get that creative itch scratched. But for us, it had already been settled. We were going to do a podcast about 80s movies. You also need to know, how long is it going to be? How often are you going to do it? But the initial goal that we had was that every podcast would be between an hour and 90 minutes. To date, we have done a total of 48 podcasts. The shortest one we've done is 87 minutes, but the average is about 2 hours and 45. So you need to be able to adapt to the situation as things change. Who are you going to do it with? This is one of my buddies. This is the guy that is actually my podcast co-host. He is someone that I went to high school with. He still lives in Wisconsin, and that'll actually come into play as we talk about this. But you also want to know, who is your audience? Who is the group that you intend to actually consume this podcast, assuming you do get a listenership? And you can look at it from the perspective of like the MPAA rating system. And one of the goals that he had is he wanted it to be somewhere in the G to PG rated realm, because he felt that he has a pastor that might listen to it. That actually lasted about 3-4 weeks before we kind of abandoned that and said, yeah, if your pastor listens, I guess you're going to have to find a new church. But you also need to know when. When are you going to record? How often are you going to record? We record once a week for the most part. We record on Saturdays generally. That is subject to change based on schedules, kids, et cetera, et cetera. But these are all factors to kind of keep in mind. And then you need to know how to do a podcast. There's several components that go into actually getting a podcast from your brain into the iPhone or the iPad or however somebody consumes a podcast. So the first thing you have to do is create it. That's pretty straightforward. You go out, you record your podcast, and I'll get into how to do that. Then you have to send it to a podcast host. Podcast host is basically the repository of where your audio is stored. The podcast host will then seed it to different podcast directories such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And then it goes through them to your audience through a podcatcher, through a podcasting app. So this is where we start getting into the monetary, how you can do a podcast on the cheap, is what do you actually need to make a podcast? Honestly, if you're listening to this podcast, you already have everything you need to do, everything that you already need, you have in your possession, whether it be a smartphone or an iPad or a phone. They say the best microphone to use is the microphone that you have. You literally can use different apps on either an Android or an Apple phone and record a podcast directly, edit it on your phone, and send it up to your podcast host with no other things involved. The thing is, if you are going to do that, there is a cost to that. And that cost is actually in the sound quality. The sound quality is probably the most important thing about a podcast, because no matter what your subject matter is, if your podcast audio quality is bad, nobody's going to want to listen to it. And this device right here, a USB headset, is kind of like a step up from using a built-in microphone on a computer or a phone. And this is actually the very model that I used for every podcast I did until I started my own. And there's a theory that I'm sure all of you have heard of. It's the weakest link theory. And that is not talking about the game show host that is hosted by some snarky person, but rather it is the theory that anything is only as strong as its weakest link. As I mentioned before, audio is the cornerstone of all podcasts. If your audio is garbage, your podcast probably is going to be garbage. But here is a pro tip. Don't go out and buy a bunch of equipment if you're thinking about starting a podcast. If you go out and spend $500 and you do a podcast for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then you decide, nah, I don't really want to do this, it's kind of a time sink, you're out $500. Of course, when I got the text from my friend, I went out and I bought a podcasting kit, because that's just kind of the way I do things. And I used, at the time that we started, I used a Blue Yeti microphone, and I've actually changed microphones several times. And my partner uses a Yeti Snowball microphone, but the Yeti Snowball is actually kind of what I would recommend. If you're going to do it and you feel like you have to spend money because you want to take that first iterative step up as far as the quality is concerned, look at something in that $30 range, that $50 range. Even though it's not going to sound as great as a higher dollar value mic, it is going to sound better than anything that is recorded directly from a phone or a computer. If you're using a PC like I used to do, you need a way to capture the audio. But even if you aren't capturing the audio with your PC, you will need to edit with a PC or some other audio editing apparatus. I actually looked at several different sound products out there, several different software suites as far as what you can use in order to edit and or record your podcast. I use a software package called Audacity. It's simple to use. It has a ton of features. And most importantly, it is free. And if you are recording locally, that is you and whoever else is on your podcast is in one location, you're all set. You can just record it and you can go. If you are co-located like I am, as I mentioned, my podcast host is actually in Wisconsin, what you should do is you should both capture audio on your own and then merge it together in a program like Audacity. However, my co-host doesn't even have a PC. He does all of his podcasting directly through an iPad. So I capture all the audio on my side, but I needed a way to be able to capture audio remotely. And there's a couple different ways that you can do that. There are some that I'm sure you've heard of. You can actually record video and audio, but usually just audio from Skype or from Zoom. The quality is not going to be great unless you get a professional service package from one of those two companies. I actually use something, it's called Clean Feed. It is a completely web-based solution, and it sounds great. It is not as good as if you are there in person, but it is really close. And they do offer a free package that allows you to record as many concurrent streams as you want at the same time. The only downside is you cannot actually adjust individual audio levels, which can be a little bit difficult. This is actually the interface of what clean feed looks like. And you can see that you have these different bars that are telling you how loud, what is the gain, what is the amplification of each of your sources. And you want to make sure that they are close, because if they're not close, it can be a problem. There is an old saying in construction to measure twice and cut once. After the first couple podcasts, I decided that I had this stuff down. I knew what I was doing. I no longer needed to actually check audio levels after or before a podcast. I could just get them on the line, do our podcast, and roll with it. And I found out the hard way that's not true, because each time you connect, potentially you're going to have different varying audio levels. And we had a podcast where his level was so hot and mine was so low that I had to go in and I had to adjust the audio for every sentence that was spoken. And that's a pain. And that's even more of a pain when you're doing a podcast. That one I think was 2.5 hours. It took me like 6 hours to edit a 2-hour podcast. Few last things about production. If you're going to use music, which I strongly suggest you do for an opening or for music beds, you need to make sure that you have the right to do so. The music I use as a bed, which you heard earlier, which is this, is what is called a Creative Commons License 0 song, which means that I can use it for anything I want, whether it be for personal use or professional use, and it requires no attribution. And then I also do sound clips, and I purchased a program called SoundPad, and that allows me to drop in sound clips throughout a podcast, whatever I want to do. And that cost me, I think, about $10-12. And now that I've went over kind of like how to do a podcast, I can get a little bit more into the hardware that I do in just a second. But we've talked about how to do the podcast, what you need to create the podcast. Now you need to talk about, where are you going to host this? There are countless different hosts that are out there that will host your podcast for you. When you're looking at different podcast hosts, you want to consider a couple different factors. You want to look at how much it costs. There are free options. Almost every podcast host has a free option, but almost all the podcast hosts that have free options are limited, and they are limited in how many downloads you can get, whether it be a month or a year or a week. And then also they limit the duration of how long your podcast can be, as well as they limit the total number of podcasts you can have at any given time. I looked at lots of different ones, and I realized I was never going to make any money doing this, and that was not the goal. But I wanted to also find one that fed this giant circle here. I wanted to find a host that would feed as many different podcatchers as possible, so that if anybody wanted to listen to my podcast for some reason, they would have the ability to do so. And I found a podcast host. It's called Anchor. And I picked them for a couple reasons. They have no limits on podcasting. They have no limits on the number of podcasts, the number of downloads, how long your podcasts are. And in addition, they are actually owned by Spotify, which means that they are going to definitely have a presence with feeding this to as many ears as possible. So I wanted to give a couple recommendations for if you were thinking about starting a podcast, as far as equipment and different things you should think about. Start small. Don't think you're going to go out there and be able to quit your job because you're going to have such a huge success. I mean, if you figure you have 300 friends on Facebook, you'll be lucky if a third of those actually listen to you once, and extremely lucky if more than a third of that third listen to you beyond the first week. Plan it out. Have kind of like a project plan, and that's probably the project manager side of me coming out. But when we decided we were going to do it, we actually incrementally got ready to do it. We walked through the equipment we had to get, all the different things, how we were going to structure it. And we planned it out. And we also iterated as we have gone along through the podcast we've actually done. But we made sure that we had a plan, so we were not completely winging it. And I would also suggest doing a throwaway podcast. And what I mean by a throwaway podcast is do a podcast that is not meant for anybody except for you to kind of get your podcasting legs under you. That means run through the whole thing, find where your gaps are, find where the pieces that you're missing are, because you might have a ton of ideas. And as you're running through it, either with yourself on your own or with a podcasting partner, you will realize that not every idea you have is great. And you also will come up with things that you hadn't even thought of before. And lastly, I would suggest buying a mic. I know that I've kind of stressed cheap, free. That $30 microphone really, really does sound a ton better than a built-in microphone on no matter what kind of device you're using. And lastly, have fun. Unless this is what you really want to do for a career, you want to kind of put this together as something that is going to be a creative outlet for you, something that is going to be interesting, something that maybe your friends will like, something that maybe if you're single, it's a way to meet women. I don't know, but just do it, approach it as a way to have fun, and don't make it another job. And lastly, consider the hidden cost. And I know there's some people in the chat there. Can anybody tell me what the hidden cost is? Can anybody throw it up in chat? And I'll see if it actually comes up here in a second, because it's a couple more slides before I get to the hidden cost. But there is a hidden cost that I have not mentioned. But total costs with using the suggestions I have is equipment, free, unless you end up getting a mic, $30, $50. You don't have to go out and spend even 3 figures to get into that. Software, once again, free. If you really want to do clips, maybe you want to spend that $10 and get a program that'll actually create a virtual audio device so you can do sound clips, and which you also can use for video game streaming, by the way. Music, free. As I said, if you want to use music, which I strongly suggest you do, search out Creative Commons License 0, which is free. There's a lot of stuff out there, a lot of different genres. I actually have 2 different beds that I use depending on the specific stuff that we're talking about that week, and both of them fall into that same Creative Commons License 0. And find a host. Once again, you can find a free host. There are 2 free hosts that are completely free. Anchor is one of them. There's another one whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. And then there are also a lot of other podcast hosts that have free options. Most people aren't going to want to do a 3-hour podcast every week. They might want to do a half-hour podcast every 3 weeks. If that's what you want to do, you definitely can find a free podcast. So, okay, yes, we got 2 people, and I see Jason had it first. The hidden cost is time. And your time is priceless. And, anybody that has a family or a dog or whatever, any time that you're spending podcasting, you're not spending with them. And on the most optimistic way to look at it, if your podcast is an hour long, you are going to spend at least 2 hours in addition to the time you're actually recording the podcast to actually get it done. It can be a massive time sink, especially if you get roped into it by a friend that has no technical skills and uses an iPad. But it can be very fun, but it also can be a lot of time. So some people have asked me, not from work, but just in general, have asked me, what do I use? And that's either because they've heard my podcast or they've seen pictures possibly on Facebook of my equipment. And the first question is, why are you listening to it? It's not that good. But I actually am going to walk through the actual equipment that I use on mine. This is actually a picture from last Saturday as I was getting ready to do our last podcast, which I can't even remember what we did. The week before that was the Breakfast Club. I don't even remember what we did. It might have been Breakfast Club. I don't know. But this is the equipment that I use. The first thing is the microphone that I have. This is a Blue Yeti Pro XLR mic. It has both XLR and USB output, so I can either connect it directly to a computer or I can run it through a mixing board. I have a Knox windscreen and a Yeti Blue Compass Premium boom arm and a Blue Yeti Radius 3 shock mount. That's all of the pieces that go around the microphone itself. I have headphones. I use Knox Gear TX100 CAN headphones. You honestly, if you want to do a podcast, you want headphones that cover your ears. You don't want to use little earbuds. You want to use CAN ones so that you can actually get a feel for what the sound actually sounds like. The primary laptop I use is an HP Envy i7 with 12 gigabytes of RAM. I use this for audio capture and audio editing. And this includes the clean feed interface that I talked about earlier to actually capture my podcast co-host's audio over the internet. And I actually run a second monitor. So on one screen, I have the audio levels that are coming in from my partner. And then on the other screen, I have all of my notes for that week typed up in Microsoft Word so I can go through them and you don't hear paper shuffling the entire time. I use 2 Stream Deck XLs in order to do sound clips. These are actually individually addressable screens. Each of these has 32 things that you can put in individual JPEGs or GIFs and associate them with sound clips, running it through SoundPad. And then I have a Cherry keyboard, which is a programmable keyboard that has customizable keycaps. I use that for any of the sound clips that I use that are not changing from week to week. For example, any kind of music beds or laughter or things like that. I actually run this through a second PC. I used to run it all through the primary PC, but I stopped doing that because I wanted to have the ability to change the audio level of everything. And I run everything through this, which is called a Rodecaster Pro. This is a mixing board. It has 4 different microphone inputs. And you can see on the right-hand side, it has those colored buttons. Those are where you can put individual fadeable sound clips as well. And so I have my sound clips, my podcast partner, my board clips, and my microphone. I have 4 different sources that I'm monitoring the audio levels with throughout the podcast to adjust them to make sure that nobody is too loud or too quiet. And then the last thing is, this is a little podcast swag. This is a t-shirt that has my podcast logo on it. It is a one of a kind. It is the only one that exists. Okay. So the total cost of all my equipment, my wife actually was looking at this deck, so I'm just going to say that it was too much. It was not cheap, but I do get use out of all of it, and that's why I don't feel bad about it. So now we're going to get to the second part of this, which is podcasting on the go. But any questions that anybody has about the first section, we'll have a chance for questions at the end as well. But if there's anything just that somebody wants to pop in real quick and ask anything, otherwise I will just continue to move along. Okay. But the whole idea of podcasting on the go, as I mentioned, this presentation and my entire podcast empire probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for COVID. There are so many podcasts now that exist that did not exist before COVID. As I mentioned in the brief that I submitted to get selected for this was, somebody asked for the laughter. I said that everybody has a podcast. My dog has a podcast, and my dog actually has a better listener count than I do. But everybody seems to have one now. They're kind of like tattoos. When it used to be, if you had a tattoo, that made you stand out. Now, just like if you don't have a tattoo, if you don't have a podcast, that makes you a little bit more unique than somebody that does. And eventually the pandemic is going to be over. At least I hope so. And I skipped a couple of these. And people are going to want to get out into public. And along with that, are a lot of these podcasts going to go away? Probably. But you might ask, what does this actually have to do with podcasting in general? So, as I've mentioned before, probably multiple times, because it is something that I've really learned, is that the most important element of a podcast is sound and sound quality. And controlled spaces, whether it be a studio or a man cave or your office or whatever, really help you get the best audio that you can. And for anybody that's on this presentation that's my age, I'm sure you probably listened to the radio when you were younger. And when you listen to the radio, sometimes they would have radio remotes where they would have a DJ at a bar or a club or something. And you probably always notice that the audio in the remotes was never as good as the audio is when they were in the studio because they lost that controlled environment. And outside of a controlled environment, there are multiple things that you need to consider that you don't need to think about when you're in a studio. I mentioned the environment, but that environment it includes background noise, people talking, people walking by, people yelling at you, things that you don't have to usually think about within a studio. And you also have to think about power. And what I mean by power is actually electrical power. And with electrical power, even if you're in a location that has it, it might not be in a place where it is readily available for where you want to use it. For example, if you were going to do a podcast from a bar, they have power in a bar, but they might not have an outlet there. And I'm sure you don't want to drag an extension cord all the way over from one location to another, even if they will let you. So as I mentioned before, the best microphone to use is the microphone you have. Podcasting on the go, the easiest way to do it is to do it with a device like an iPad or an iPhone or a Google phone, anything that is extremely portable in your hand that you already have. But you're once again going to be sacrificing that audio quality. That's why I came up with the idea of podcasts in a bag. And I'm going to go through two different scenarios, two different solutions. And both of these solutions will give you a quality product, at least quality audio quality wise, while still giving you the ability to be flexible with where and how you record a podcast. Both of these are also portable, and literally a podcast solution in a bag you can carry, throw over your shoulder, have your assistant carry, whatever. It gives you flexibility without sacrificing quality. It's portable, as I said, and this is where, and I'm going to need to rely here on playing the first video. I don't know if I need to stop presenting in order to do that, but this is where the first video goes. So this is the part where I talk about how to do podcasting out of a bag. Here's a bag, it can be any bag. And this first part I'm going to show you is how to do just a basic, while still sounding good podcast without a whole lot of equipment. So this is an old microphone I've had for multiple years. I've actually done podcasts with this. It works. It's decent. This is literally all you need to do it. Sound quality is not the best. It's a little bit better than doing it with your phone, but it is not perfect. So I would recommend against doing this. Better than a phone, but not as good as it can be. So this is what's called a Zoom H6. And this is kind of a successor to this one. And this is a modular unit. And if you want, you take off the little piece, and it actually has little attachments that you can do. You plug in the attachment, turn it on, I can interview, and your microphone is here, my microphone is here, and we'll get back and forth. It also has another plug-in which is very similar to the one I already showed you, which has the two angled mics that is just meant for like a sit-down interview instead of holding it. Same thing, you have two microphones on either side. But the thing I really like about this unit as opposed to this unit is you actually have the ability to use real microphones. You're going to get decent sound out of here, but you're not going to get as good a sound as you're going to get out of a regular microphone. So I'm reaching into my bag, I've already assembled them, and I have two different microphones. So I can have an interviewer and an interviewee. And the thing that's beautiful about this is you can actually plug these microphones directly into this unit. They have individual levels, so you can actually do it that way. You turn it on, it has a color screen. I'll actually turn it on here. You'll see it has a color screen here. And with these different knobs here, you can actually go ahead and you can change the volume of the input of all the microphones. It has 4 by default. You can replace this with a different unit that'll actually do 2 additional. So you can do up to 6 different microphones recording off of here with all individual levels. So this is a really good way to get a great sounding podcast anywhere in the world with minimal equipment. So I I showed you the first one, and that one is really nice. And one of the things I should have mentioned that I didn't is there are two different types of microphones. There are what are called dynamic microphones, and then there are condenser microphones. The microphone that I use, that I'm using right now, is actually a condenser microphone. And a condenser microphone actually picks up a wider spread of it. It's not very pinpoint, where a dynamic mic is very, very much right in your face. You need to literally be on top of the microphone to get the best sound, which is one of the reasons why I actually use a condenser mic, is so I do not have to be right up on the microphone in order to use it. And my connection seems low at the moment. I'm on audio only. I'm going to go back, and I'm actually just going to use the slides, and I'm going to do it that way. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, Matt.
Can you see my slide, my deck, or no?
I can see the one that says fantastic audio quality.
Okay, great. But you still need to account for the environment, which is what I'm talking about. And the microphones that were in that video that I showed you are dynamic mics, and those are perfect for a place where you do not have as much control, because it is going to get audio, but you have to be right up on the microphone in order to get that. The device I showed you is also PC compatible. You can actually plug it into your PC and it will work as an audio mixer. And of course, now that we got this working, I'm going to have you play the second video. This one's a little bit longer, and this one is going to show you how to do what I call a fully formed podcast solution when you are not in a place where it is an uncontrolled environment and you actually don't even have power. So I've showed you how to do a basic podcast out of a bag. Very, very straightforward. And you're going to get decent sound quality out of that scenario. But as I've kind of talked over the last 40 minutes, I'd like to do a little bit more of a fully fledged, fully formed podcast, including sound clips, ability to monitor levels, a music bed, stuff like that. So I'm going to show you the bag that, it's actually not a bag, it's more of a suitcase. But it's this item here, and I've actually already emptied everything out, but you can see here, it has spaces and compartments for everything that I'm going to show you here. So I'm just going to close that, and I'm going to, first of all, the first thing is the Rodecaster. I've already talked about the Rodecaster a little bit. It's the heart and soul of this podcast. And then I have two different microphones that I use, and they need to sit on something, so I'm going to assemble two quick mic stands. And these are heavy duty. These are not going to fall over. You just screw them together, screw the microphone to the mic stand, and hook them up, and you can have one person over here and then have the other person over here, and you can have two podcast mics. You can see the Rode actually supports up to 4 different microphone inputs. So I don't have 4 because I don't have 4 friends or 3 friends to actually be able to do it. So 2 is going to handle more than I'll ever need for this. But these are together, so I have this. The next thing is what's called a cloud lifter. And you see I already have the cables attached to the cloud lifter. But what the cloud lifter is it is a device that it actually boosts the gain on these microphones. So gain is the amount of power or the amount of volume that is coming out of the microphones. And in general, when you boost the gain by pushing up a slider on a board, you're going to be introducing noise. This introduces clean gain, so it has a louder output without any distortion, hum, or hiss. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to plug these in. I'm going to plug it into mic 2 and mic 3. And the reason I'm using mic 2 and mic 3 is because mic 1 is the one I use in my regular home setup. So I plug these microphones in here. And these are color coded. You can actually put little things on there so you know which one goes with which. It doesn't really make a difference. But so now this is completely plugged in. Have my headset. Already have an adapter on, so I can use it. It's a 1/4 to 1/8 inch adapter. I go to the back of the Rodecaster. I plug it into my headphone jack, and I'm set to go with one small problem. You'll see I have 2 mic, headphone, don't have anything over here. This is where the power goes. This does not have a built-in battery. This is meant to be a solution that actually sits in the studio. So I have this thing. And this is the equivalent of an AC adapter. Pair it with a regular thing that you might use to charge your phone. Plug it into a 2 amp output. Screw it in, make sure that you have a charge on your battery. Hit the power button on the Rodecaster. And I heard it pop on, so I know that it has power. And you will see that the lights are now lit up, and you can actually see that the podcaster itself, the screen is on. These mics are hot. I can pad them up, pod them down. I can use my sound clips. I can hear the theme to my podcast in my ears right now. So this is a way that you can take a fully formed solution, take it anywhere. You don't need to have power. Even if you do have power, you can set this up. I could use this if I went camping. This is a perfect solution if you want to do a fully realized professional podcast anywhere other than where you have regular power. Okay, so that one was a little bit longer. I'm going to actually just try, I only have 2 slides left, so I'm going to try to do it directly from the presentation. Can you see the podcast in the bag? Is this overkill slide right now?
I sure can.
Great. So the question is this overkill? Is the setup that I have overkill for what I do? Almost certainly. It is definitely more equipment than someone that has an audience of few really needs. But that raises the question of why. I have a lot of different hobbies, and usually when I get into a hobby, I go in way overboard, whether that be video games or drones, or in this case, podcasting. But I wanted to basically do whatever I could to make sure that I'm putting out the best possible product I can for the few people that actually do listen to me. And that is one of the things where, the cost is incremental, and the better your quality will get better as you spend more money. But the more money you spend, it's not equal. It's not like you spend $100, it's 10 times better than a podcast you spent $10 on. It doesn't work out that way. And the more money you spend, it's like the better it gets from a quality wise standpoint, gets less. And I basically wanted to do something where at the end of the day, from just purely from a production standpoint, is it something that is listenable? Content wise, God no. But from an actual production point of view, absolutely. And that's why I got the equipment that I have. And as far as the use, that podcast in a box or a bag, or in that case, it's really a suitcase, I'm actually going to take that with me when I go on my canoeing trip in August to a cabin in the remote woods of Wisconsin. And I'm going to do a full podcast from there. And that's something that I'll be able to do because of that equipment. And I'll be able to do it exactly the same as if I was sitting at home. Only difference is I won't have running water and I will not have electricity. So that is what I had for my presentation. Hopefully there was something that was worth listening to in it. And I wanted to open it up for questions.
Terry had a question there earlier about how good of a PC do you need to do the recordings?
For the recordings, so that's a great question. That is absolutely a great question. The thing is, you can do it on probably anything i3 or higher. The only trade-off you're going to have is you will end up doing a lot of processing. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I discovered something that I hadn't been doing before. And what that actually is you can capture silence. And I know that sounds like a weird thing to think about, but before we start a podcast, we basically say nothing for 5 seconds, and it gives us 5 seconds of silence. And you use that as a gauge, and then that will actually remove hiss and background noise from the rest of your podcast, and it has to process that. The only thing from a computer point of view is it is going to be much slower the cheaper of a PC you have. For example, I went from an i5 to an i7, and processing a 2-hour long file went from taking 15 minutes to taking about 4 minutes. But it does take time to actually process it. And what I just to give you a real world example, when I get done with a podcast on a Saturday night, I will immediately go through and I'll edit it, and I have to process it first to get it from the board that I recorded on onto my PC. That takes about 20 minutes. And then I do the silence. That takes about 10 minutes because I run through it twice. And then I edit it. And with an older PC, you can do all that stuff. It is just going to take you longer to do those processing parts.
Cool. I don't know if your camera was working or if it's off, but also I just clicked over to let Eric join. He had his hand up, so okay. I think it does take a little bit of time when somebody joins.
And I do see some questions here. He says, what is the function of a web-based tool for audio? That is because my co-host is in a different state and he does not have a PC. So he does not have the means to actually capture the audio and then send it to me. So the only way that we can do it is through a web-based interface. That's the reason I use CleanFeed. And then what did you say the purpose of 2 laptops was again? The reason I switched to 2 laptops, and this is actually relatively recent, it's within the last 2 months I started doing that, is I run my sound clips that I run off of those 3 different little keyboards. That's the only thing I use that PC for. And the reason I do it that way is when I run it into the board, it makes that a distinct input compared to before when I was using it on the same PC that I capture my co-host audio with, and it was on the same channel. So it allows me to adjust his volume and adjust the sound clip volume independently so that they can all be equal. Okay, have I ever looked at real-time podcasting with video? If you're looking at the screen, you can see what I look like. No, I have not. No, but we've talked about it, but it just would not work for who we are and how we're doing it, because there ends up being a lot of stuff that gets cut, and there's a lot of breaks in it. And there's also dogs barking and things like that that wouldn't make a video podcast really, the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze on it, I don't think. Okay, any other questions? Important. Any other questions?
I don't see any over there, Matt. So we'll give Eric a second and see if he's able to join. I know I tried to get him to join, but yeah, it doesn't look like it's going to let him in maybe, but.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody. And I honestly, I could not tell because I was trying to look at 2 different screens at the same time. So I don't know who was on. I did see a couple people in the questions. I do want to thank everybody that did take time off of their busy day to attend this. And if for any reason anybody does have any questions about stuff like this, I'm more than happy to tell you what I know. It won't take a particularly long time to do so, but it is a thing where I think that one of the things that COVID has taught me is like the collaborative nature of people to help out with things that you normally would do yourself is just really great.
It's awesome. Hey, there was one last question, Matt, asking if you would be able to send over a list to the different itemized software and whatnot that you had talked about. So
sure, it's real simple. I can send that to you, and you can put it in the notes. It basically is for software. There's 3 things. There's Audacity, which is AUDACITY. That is the audio manipulation software. There is a website which is cleanfeed.net. And then the other one is SoundPad. And SoundPad is the thing I use for sound clips, which actually creates what's called a virtual audio device. So it allows you to play back a sound clip through your microphone so other people can hear it. And that's the only piece of software that I use that actually costs money. And I think that's like $10 or $12.
Cool. I also posted those links in chat. I hope I got the right ones.
Yep, those are correct. Yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Matt. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences and all the sounds like various types of systems you went through and hardware and software to get to this point. Hey, one thing, did you ever tell us what your podcast is called so we can subscribe to it?
No, I did not, and that was intentional. So if you really want to listen to it, you can find it. It is extremely easy to find. I purposely was kind of vague about that because of the nature of the podcast. As I mentioned, we started it kind of on a GPG thing. And as anybody that has seen me at the Funny Bone, for example, you know that sometimes I can veer into those not so G or PG rated areas. And I just wanted to make sure that there was a clear separation, that this is not meant to be seen as a professional venture. And, you know, I wanted to talk about it without actually trying to pimp it out, if you will. I have absolutely no embarrassment about it. I just want it to be separate from my professional thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So hit Matt up later if you. Well, anyway, thanks again for sharing, Matt. We appreciate it. And thanks to everyone that attended. I'll send out a survey to get feedback from everybody and whatnot so we can constantly improve. But absolutely appreciate everyone taking some time out. And Matt, especially putting this together for us. We do certainly appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
All right. Thanks. We'll see you.